Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And it's another Stephen King book I'll be talking about today. I'm reading every book by Stephen King in order of publication. And so now I'm at the 1980s with Firestarter. This is his first book from the 1980s, Stephen King. Firestarter from 1981. I had read this novel once before when I was probably 18 or 19 years old. Somewhere around there. Maybe I was even younger than that when I read this. I'm not sure. But I remember thinking that this was just okay. Although, reading it again, I realized how much I had forgotten or just missed the first time. I enjoyed it a lot more this time, that's for sure. I think this is a pretty good book, actually, Stephen King's Firestarter. I think it works better as a novel than The Stand does. As a novel, I think it holds up better. Otherwise, I don't think this is as good as any of his previous books, probably. This is probably the weakest of his books, which is not to say it's bad. It's not a bad book. It's a pretty good book, actually. But there are some things about it, which I will get into. This is, of course, the story of the young girl who can light fires with her mind because her parents were part of an experiment when they were in their college years. They wanted an extra couple $100. So they were injected with a mysterious substance which gave them superpowers. You know how it goes, you know. And so at the beginning of this book, they got married, these two who were in this experiment. They had the child. And this young girl, Charlie, develops the ability to light fires with her mind. And so she's, you know, dangerous. And also, the evil government wants to catch her and, you know, figure out how to replicate her powers or use her as a weapon or whatever the evil government wants to do. It's the government, they're evil, you know, because it's Stephen King. And there was a lot of distrust for the government at the time that this was written. Completely understandable distrust. And so you have the beginning of the 1980s conspiracy theory, paranoia kind of thing going on. This book starts off really, really strong with Charlie and her father on the run. The father, Andy, we see a lot of the story through his point of view. Andy is a very sympathetic character. He will do anything to protect his daughter. We can all relate to that. And he's in a dire situation because he's on the run from the government. This shadowy government agency which is trying to track them down. And so it starts off really strong because it's a chase story. You know, they're on the run, barely keeping ahead of these agents who are after them. And so for the first chunk of the book, it's basically a chase story, a good one. There's a lot of momentum going on in this story. But there's a point in this story where that momentum just stops. It just hits a wall and stops, and it becomes a very different kind of story. Not bad, but it is different. And it's kind of a striking difference. Where all of a sudden, where you had, you know, a fair amount of action and things going on. Forgive my awful dog. Barking in the background as usual. But anyway, you get to a point in the story where suddenly not too much happens outside of characters' minds. So a lot of the action that happens for a good chunk of this book is just happening in people's heads. And very little is actually happening. Well, very little is actually happening. And so it's not bad. It's actually really interesting. But the forward momentum of the story just stops and it turns into something different before it kicks into high gear again at the end, which it does. This has one of the stronger endings, I think, that Stephen King books have had. You get the sense that he kind of knew where this was going. Much like the previous book, The Dead Zone, you get a feeling that he had the basic bare bones of this plotted out. I could be wrong, but it feels that way. The execution of the plot isn't always great. It does meander. There are dead spots in this. But the characters are all really interesting. You spend a lot of time with a lot of the evil agents, and probably too much time with those characters. But again, most of it works. It just has a hard time overcoming that kind of slump it hits when the momentum suddenly ceases and it transforms into kind of a different sort of book. A more of a slow burn kind of thing. But it's still a pretty good book. It has one of the stronger villains that you'll find in a Stephen King book. Unfortunately, you run into issues with this villain because the villain is Native American. And up to this point, Stephen King's track record with characters who are not white hasn't been great up to this point. Non-white characters tend to be either magical or criminals or just not around. So you have a Native American character who's actually a really interesting character. Good villain in that he's a menacing villain, this character. But you also have some kind of the Native American tropes thrown in there with this character. So it's kind of a problematical character, I guess. But as a villain, he is effective. That is true. And I did think that the book ended well. So it's not the best Stephen King book, but it was pretty good overall. Better than I remember it being. I stayed with it. I didn't get bored, even with that little slump that happened. And even though the tone of the whole thing shifted to something very different, I stayed with it because the characters were interesting. One thing Stephen King does do well is he does make interesting characters. And you remain emotionally involved with the characters. I did in this book anyway. And so I think it's worth reading. If you're interested in Stephen King, it's certainly a worthwhile read. It's not the first thing I would pick up from him. If you're only going to read one Stephen King book, this is not it. It's a decent book. It's okay. I'm hoping for better. Now, the next book I've got is a nonfiction book coming up, Danse Macabre, and then Cujo. Cujo is the one I really want to get to. Because I remember that just not being great, but some other people that I really respect, A.J. Dunn, for example, Criminale, another one, have said that Cujo's pretty good. So I will probably feel different. I have felt differently about all of the Stephen King books that I've read, that I had read previously. I've had a different experience every time I've read them now. And I had a different experience reading this. I like this a lot more than I did the first time I read it. So I probably will feel the same for everything else that I read. We'll see. So yeah, decent book, Firestarter. Like I said, not the best, but decent. Hey, look, it's little Stephen King. Hey, little Stephen King. Decent book, man. It's decent. It's not like, well, it's not the best. But okay, it's a decent book. Decent. Yeah. There you go. That's my review for Firestarter. Looking forward to Danse Macabre. And I will catch you with that for my next Stephen King review. And I will catch you next time here at Stately Vaughn Manor. Bye, guys.